Good morning, good afternoon, good night, everybody. Welcome back to Let's Figure This Out, the show where you can learn complex ideas in a simple way. But first, let's start off with our first segment, which is yapping about life, or it can be about life or about the channel or anything. But, anyways, um, it's starting to get cold. I don't like it. I don't like being cold. I miss summer already. Me and my wife watched Coraline last night. That was nice. And yeah, that is that's all the updates that I have for today. Okay, we have a lot to talk about today because the topic of today is Plato. You might have heard from him. Very famous guy. So why did I decide to make today's episode about Plato? Well, last episode, I talked about Socrates and I explained why I wanted to talk about him first. And Plato is like the perfect continuation because Plato was a student of Socrates. And like I said last episode, Plato was a student of Socrates and Aristotle was a student of Plato. So I feel like those three are good together, you know. But yeah, today's episode is about Plato, who is probably one of the most famous philosophers of all time, probably. He wrote a lot of what we know about Socrates because Socrates didn't write anything down, so everything that we know about Socrates was written by other people, and Plato wrote a lot of that. Plato, as a writer or as a philosopher, was kind of all over the place. He wrote about all kinds of stuff like ethics, which is what is good or bad, or what is good or evil. That's kind of what ethics is. He wrote a lot about political philosophy. He wrote about epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, or how do we know the things that we know. And he wrote about metaphysics, which is the study of kind of the universe, kind of like what is the world, the universe, um, kind of trying to explain what the world is made out of, or how it came to be, and that kind of stuff. And he also wrote a little bit about science, but back then, this is in the 5th century BCE, so back then science wasn't really compared to now. It was very basic, so we're probably not going to get into the science part of it. Um, but yeah, one disclaimer that I do need to mention is that Plato uses Socrates as a character in a lot of his writings. So the way that Plato would write a lot of his work is he would either make up a story that would kind of explain his ideas, or he would write a dialogue between two or more people where they would argue about a specific topic or that kind of stuff. And for some reason, Plato uses Socrates as one of his characters in these stories, and he did that a lot. And so there's a little bit of debate of, if there's a story where Socrates says something, or like he comes up with some concept, there's a little bit of debate about whether Socrates is the one that came up with that and Plato's just writing it down, or if Plato made up this story, right? Like Plato is the one that came up with that, but he wrote the story in a way that the character of Socrates is saying it, but it's really Plato's idea. There's not really a good way to tell, I guess. But yeah, that's something that we should keep in mind. Another thing is that Plato wrote a lot. He wrote a lot about a lot of different things. And so we're not going to go through everything, or we're going to be here all day. But I'm just going to try to talk about a few of the things that he wrote about that I think are interesting or that are popular. First, I want to talk a little bit about his life. He was born in Athens, and the estimate is that he was probably born in the 420s BCE, and then he died in around the year 340 something BCE. So he was about 80 when he died, 80 years old, which is pretty impressive, especially back then. It's like back then people died from anything. It was medicine was very primitive back then. But yeah, but so he was born into one of the wealthiest and most politically active families in Athens. And at some point, he became interested in Socrates. He became a student of Socrates, and that's how he got into philosophy. Something that I found kind of funny is apparently Plato's real name was Aristocles, and we think that Plato was actually a nickname that can be translated as broad. And so there's theories that they gave him the nickname Plato because he had a broad physique. And I saw one that also said that it was because he had a broad forehead. That would be crazy, becoming famous and you have this name because of your forehead. Anyways, so Plato was a student of Socrates for a while, and then if you listen to the last episode, uh, Socrates ended up getting executed for corrupting the youth, or for going against the government, I guess. And so after Socrates died, it's it's rumored that Plato was like traveling all over the place. Some places that we think Plato went to are places like Italy, Sicily, Libya, and Egypt. But eventually, at some point, he went back to Athens and he started his own school, which he named the Academy. And that's where we get words like academic or stuff like that. That's basically the origin. And there's a couple stories of Plato still traveling after that, but we think that he mostly just stayed at the academy after he founded it. That was like where he spent most of the rest of his life. But yeah, that is kind of what we know of his life. And there are accounts that he just died in his sleep, which, I mean, he was 80 at the time or somewhere around that. So, um, yeah, that's that's pretty much what we know of his life. So let's get into some of his philosophical arguments or concepts that he kind of popularized. Um, so the first one is about reincarnation. So Plato believed that our souls are immortal. So basically, he believed that when we die, we get you either get rewarded or punished for like 1,000 years, um, and then your soul would reincarnate and come back in another life form, or the next human or whatever. And he kind of used that belief to come up with this idea that we are born with some knowledge or some um, ideas that are regardless of your education or your background. That's how you're born, because they they were transmitted through your soul, which is immortal and has lived other lives before you. And that is contrasting with some other philosophers. There are some philosophers that argue that we are born as a blank slate. Like there's nothing there. When you're born, you don't know anything, you don't feel anything, and then all of that comes with experience, with learning, and with whatever the people around us do. That's how we learn how to think, how to feel, and everything that we know comes from other people and our environment. But Plato thought that there are some things that are just innate, that you don't have to learn or you don't have to experience. You just know them because you have an immortal soul that has lived before. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting idea, but it is it's something that has been a point of contention for a long time. I mean, it's been like thousands of years that humans have been disagreeing about that. But anyways, let's move on to the next philosophical idea that he had. And keep in mind, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible because some of these ideas are very abstract. They're like they're pretty complicated, and if we get into the details, this video is gonna take forever, or this episode is gonna take forever. So I'm just trying to keep it very, very simple. But the next philosophy of Plato is called the theory of forms. And basically, this theory claims that there are two worlds, I guess. So we have our world, and then there's another world that is like the perfect world, the ideal world. And he calls it the world of forms, where everything is perfect, and everything in our world is just an imperfect representation of that world. Um, he he explains it in a few different ways. So one of his famous explanations of the theory of forms is what is called the allegory of the cave. And in the allegory of the cave, basically, he tells this story where there's a bunch of people chained up inside of a cave with their backs turned um, to the entrance of the cave. And so they can see the shadows of everything that is outside of the cave. There's this big entrance, and the light kind of casts shadows into the cave. So these people see all these shadows, but uh, but they've never been outside of the cave, and they've never turned around. So all they know is these shadows, right? And basically, Plato compares that to our experience, and he's kind of arguing that these shadows are what we see in the real world, or in our world, I guess. And then the real things that are casting these shadows are like the world of forms. So in a way, he's kind of saying like you're just seeing the shadows, and if you want to see the real thing, then you would have to get out of the cave. Um, and that's like, I guess like it kind of it, like I get what he's trying to say, but at the same time that just sounds so like it's a big stretch. Like I don't know how to feel about that. It's like where like in the Matrix or something, and somehow he knows, and even if you knew like there's nothing that you can do about it, and it's not gonna change your experience in this world. Like let's say that you 100% believe in this theory. What are you gonna do about it? Or like how is that gonna change your life, your experience, or anything? It's I think it's interesting to think about, but I don't think it's very important for how we live our lives. I don't think it changes anything, and there's no way for you to prove or disprove any of that. Um, there's no way to argue with that kind of claim. Mm, yeah, I don't know. I think it's just more of a thought. Because, like I said, I think it's just something to think about, and that's pretty much it. Um, but yeah, another way that he kind of describes this theory of forms is he he says something like, think about two things that have something in common. So let's say a chair. A chair has something to it that makes it a chair, but it's something that you can't really define it in an objective and universal way. Like, is a chair something you sit on? Well, yes, but also I could sit on a rock. I could sit on the floor. You know, that doesn't mean that the floor is a chair. So what is a chair, right? And that basically what Plato argues is that the chair has this chairness, I guess, that makes it a chair. And every chair that you see has that chairness. Now saying chair so much, it makes it sound weird. But you get what I mean, right? Every chair has a kind of chairness in a way that as soon as we see a chair, we know it is a chair. But we can't really describe it in a universal, objective way. And so Plato believes that in the world of forms, there is a perfect form of chairness, and that is the chair. That's the perfect form of a chair. And every chair that we have in our world is just an imperfect imitation of that perfect form of chairness. It's uh, it's it's so abstract, um, very complicated to think about. Very complicated to think about and to talk about in a simple way. Like you really can't. It's you have to think about it a lot to even understand what he's talking about. And even then, it's like, okay, what what am I supposed to do with this information? Um, but yeah, I heard someone say once that there's two kinds of people. Um, People that believe in that, people who are interested in that, and people who think the world of forms is all nonsense and it doesn't make any sense. I don't know. I mean, I personally, I think it's interesting to think about for the first time. Like when I first heard of Plato and this theory, I thought about it a lot. I was like a little confused, trying to figure out what was going on. But eventually, I'm like, I don't know. There's probably better things to think about. Okay, so that is the theory of forms. Um, so let's move on to the Republic. So when Plato wrote the Republic, he had a focus on politics and on society, how to arrange society, what is the most just government, what is the most just society, I guess. He was very focused on justice, but it might be a very different concept of justice than what you might be thinking of, because Plato wanted a class system. Basically, Plato thought that the only way to escape the cave, for example, in the allegory of the cave, was by doing philosophy. And he believed that if you are living in this cave, then you should not be a ruler. You should not be a king or or in the ruling class. And so based on that, he concluded that we should have philosopher kings. Uh, it's, that's kind of funny. a philosopher writing about why we should make philosophers kings. Makes a lot of sense. But anyway, so he thought that we should have philosopher kings because if you're a philosopher, you can escape the cave, you can see the world how it really is, and um, that's the only way to know what justice really is, and the only way to rule a society in a way that is just. And what is that society then? Well, Plato believed that the ideal society would have three classes of people. The first one being the rulers, like the kings or the royal people, um, which he called the guardians. And then there's another class of people called the auxiliaries, which would be either like warriors or people who help the rulers. And then the third class of people would be what he called the producers, which would be any kind of labor, like like crafts or farming or building stuff. That would be the producers. So Plato believed that these three classes of people should be strictly separated, or not separated, but kind of like they that they are very focused on their role. He was kind of like the guardians are the rulers, so you are supposed to rule, and that's your role. Like that's what you do. You just rule, and don't worry about anything else. Then the auxiliaries, you're just supposed to fight and help the rulers. That that's what you do. You just help the rulers, and if you need to fight, then you fight. And then the producers, he said that he basically said something like nature gives you an ability or or a skill, and if you're a producer, then your job is to just your job is just to exercise whatever skill or whatever craft nature has allowed you to to do. Um, so if you're a carpenter, then your job is just to build stuff, and that's it. Basically, he was like, stay in your lane. Uh, it's obviously there's more lessons in the Republic that are good to think about, but this one in particular is very interesting, especially because he was a philosopher and he's basically saying like philosophers should be the kings, and then you auxiliaries, you just help me, and then producers, you just do your job and stay in your lane. Um, not very, not very demure. The Republic was not very cutesy, not very mindful at all. But a lot of political philosophers, or like, a lot of people in power back then took inspiration from that. Um, they either tried to learn from the Republic or they would, kind of uh, go off of it to create their own idea of what they wanted to do with society. So it was very influential. even though it's it can be a little controversial, but it was definitely very influential for the people that came after him. And I think it's good to know like how things evolve, or like where these ideas come from, and like that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm sure he wasn't the first one to have something like this, but um, he was very famous. A lot of people studied his work, and so even though there's probably a lot of other people that have said similar things, like he's the one that a lot of people that came after looked at, and that's interesting. That was the peak political philosophy of ancient Greece, I guess. But yeah, I mean, Plato's influence was very wide ranging. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, he was kind of all over the place with his work. Ethics, political philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, a little bit of science. Although at the time, science wasn't really good. So, um, but he contributed to all those topics. And as weird as some of his ideas might be, and even though there's been people that came after him that kind of expanded upon his work and improved it or changed it, or kind of challenged his ideas, I still think um, it's pretty impressive how influential he came to be. And yeah, I think it's something that is interesting to think about. But anyways, enough of Plato for today. um, Hopefully now you have an idea of who Plato was, and a little bit about his philosophies, some of his theories. We talked about his thoughts on the soul. He thought that the soul was immortal and that you carry on a little bit of knowledge from your past lives. We talked about his theory of forms, that this world is just an imperfect imitation of the world of forms, which is perfect. And his work on the Republic, a very influential and famous political work, political philosophy work. And yeah, hopefully now you have at least an idea of what he was all about. So let's move on to the last segment, which is, do I have any plans that are, it could be personal or about the channel? I don't know. I guess content wise, I've been enjoying making these episodes, and yeah, it's all very exciting, very new. But yeah, I want to keep going, and I'm enjoying this, and I hope that you enjoy listening. For next episode, we are probably going to talk about Aristotle, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, that's going to do it for today's episode. I hope you learned something today. And as always, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time so we can figure this out.